Friends, a very good evening and welcome to Westminster Abbey. My name is Jamie Hawkey, I'm Canon Theologian here, and I also chair the Westminster Abbey Institute, which was founded to nurture and revitalise moral and spiritual values in public life and service. Convening discussion and nourishing reflection focus on the critical issues of our days are key to the Institute's identity and work. We're really thrilled to be hosting this event tonight under the banner of One People, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Particularly pleased to welcome you to this rather wonderful space, our Undercroft. Some of you may remember it years and years ago, before we built the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Galleries, when it was a rather unsatisfactory museum space. It's been refurbished, and this is the first event that we've held in it since, so I'm delighted that you're here. So this event is being held under the banner of One People. The term One People was coined in 1965 by one of my predecessors as a Canon of Westminster, Edward Carpenter, went on to be Dean, the 35th Dean of Westminster. One People as a theme for the year-long celebrations which marked the 900th anniversary of St. Edward's Abbey Church, the second church on this site. Today, as then, One People, this theme, reflects Westminster Abbey's commitment to nurturing a shared consciousness and humanity for all people, whatever faith or no faith. And since the inauguration of this theme, usually in an oration in 1966, we've covered a wide range of topics from democracy to diplomacy, from peacekeeping to poverty. But tonight's topic, health, housing and human flourishing, understanding organisms in the context of their environments, captures the essence of One People perfectly, provoking discussion, challenging perceptions, and enhancing shared knowledge about the fundamental interconnection between science, research, interdisciplinary understanding, and the implications for all people via policy and practice. And we're extraordinarily privileged to have a distinguished panel with us this evening. The Reverend Professor Andrew Davison, Regius Professor of Divinity in the University of Oxford and student of Christ Church, to whom we are extremely grateful for the leading role he played in developing this idea and indeed in inviting Professor Sultan to join us. Professor Sonia Sultan, whose groundbreaking research is the stimulus for our discussion this evening. We're honoured to have you with us, Sonia. Sarah Woolnough, the Chief Executive of the King's Fund, and Mick Clark, the Chief Executive of The Passage, Westminster's homelessness charity. I do want to thank the Leverhulme Centre for Life in the Universe for flying Sonia over, principally for a large conference in Cambridge, but also for this evening's event. So you have their biographies on your seats. We're in for a real treat. We're going to begin by hearing from Sonia, then our other panelists, and after an initial conversation of around 20 minutes between them, we'll open up the discussions and take some of the connections forward from the floor. So thank you once again for joining us, and it gives me enormous pleasure to hand over to Professor Sonia Sultan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Canon Hawkey, and thank you all for your interest. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have the chance to tell you a little about my work, the ideas that motivate my work, and hope that they create some connections in your minds. I'll be very interested to take your thoughts or questions later on in the evening. Tonight I want to share with you a major shift taking place in the biological sciences, which is a new focus on the impact of the environment on living organisms. And that new focus is changing how we think about our own environments and their impact on our health and well-being. So in some ways, this is a rethinking of the old question of nature and nurture. And I'll explain that a little bit. I hope you can see the screen, and if not, I think you have your own copies. I should mention that the additional slides, which may or may not come up in questions, are in your copies. So be comforted. It is only 7 pages of slides that I plan to talk about. So I'm hoping to speak just for about 15 minutes. Okay. So Starting in 1953, when Watson, Crick, and Franklin discovered that the double helix DNA molecule carries genetic information, the complete DNA code or genotype of an animal or plant has been viewed as a program or blueprint, it's often called, that specifies all of that plant or animal's features and behavior, what biologists call its phenotype, what the organism actually is and does. And according to this very simplified view, the DNA sequence spells out the exact instructions required to create a particular organism with its own unique traits. Now, this genetic determinism is often applied equally to human beings, as articulated here by James Watson in his 2003 book, DNA, The Secret of Life, title on which I will not comment. We used to think our fate was in our stars. Now we know, in large measure, our fate is in our genes. You may be glad to know that contemporary biologists are finding that with very few exceptions, that is not the case. Instead, many hundreds of laboratory and molecular studies with plants and animals have shown that an organism's development and function are shaped fundamentally by its environmental conditions because environmental factors regulate how genes are expressed. In other words, the environment alters not the DNA sequence or code, but how the code works, what the genes do. These regulatory effects are mediated in a number of complicated ways, including through recently discovered molecular changes that are collectively known as epigenetics. You may or may not have heard of that. And these epigenetic changes are extremely interesting because they can be induced by specific environmental stresses or conditions to chemically mark the DNA molecule in ways that turn specific genes on and off. We didn't know about these mechanisms until about 20, maybe 25 years ago, the very first findings, which were considered to be flukes. They're not flukes. Epigenetics is everywhere, every system that's been studied, very much including us. So I'll come back a little bit later just to that idea about these epigenetic changes and what they may mean. So an organism's features and behavior emerges from the interaction of its genes and its environment. And as you'll see, I'll use that word environment in a very broadest sense. That means it's more accurate to consider the genotype not as a blueprint, but as a repertoire of alternative possible outcomes depending on the environment. And those outcomes may be environmentally influenced positively or negatively. Recent research that includes both genes and environments, relevant aspects of environments, give a very different picture than this one, the one I just showed you with the little frog, which I will illustrate very briefly with a couple of biomedical examples. So these are human examples, so they're studies done on humans, obviously not experimental studies, but rather studies done by comparing groups of people, or what are called cohorts. So here's a bit of data. This plot shows the results of a lung cancer study that looked at both genes relevant to lung cancer and dietary environment. And that red line shows that in people who have a certain variant of a particular gene, when those people eat very little broccoli, having that mutation increases their risk of lung cancer. And for that reason, that genetic variant has been called a lung cancer mutation, as if it always results in lung cancer. However, if you look at the left side of that plot, where people who ate broccoli and related vegetables at least 2 times a week, in those people, that effect disappears. The mutation has no negative impact at all, compared with people who have the more typical form of the gene. So what we're looking at is an environmental remedy to a genetic problem, which can happen with an interaction between genes and environment. More importantly, also notice that this diet, which is eating broccoli or related vegetables 2 or more times a week, this diet lowers the cancer risk for both groups of people, whichever version of the gene they have. And I wanted to mention to you that there are a lot of wonderful vegetables in this plant family. This excellent health benefit can be achieved with any of them. So I encourage you to experiment. There are many options here. Okay. I also wanted to mention a 2020 study that looked at both genetic and environmental factors in a mental health outcome. The researchers here assessed the incidence of depression in a sample of 8,000 individuals who had different levels of physical activity. So that's the environmental factor here. In this case, they examined a number of genes that have all been associated with depression, and they scored each of the 8,000 people in the study as having either many of these genetic risk factors, those are the people shown in red, or few genetic risk factors, people shown in blue. And the results showed something very interesting, which is that depression was more likely for the people at low genetic risk who did not exercise than it was for the people considered to be at high genetic risk who exercised for 3 or more hours a week. So in this case, the potential impact of multiple genes that have been statistically associated with depression was overcome by a beneficial exercise environment. And notice again, for both groups of people, regardless of their genotypes, those who exercised had a lower incidence of depression than those who did not. Many, many studies of this kind, testing the impact of genetic differences in alternative environments, have confirmed 2 general points. First, as I mentioned, because environmental factors alter gene expression, they play a major role in phenotypic outcomes, including human health. The second point was first made by the distinguished British geneticist J.B.S. Haldane in a remarkable post-war essay published in 1946 titled The Interaction of Nature and Nurture. Haldane's point, and the point I can make to you now based on a great deal more data, is that it is very rare for any genotype to be unfavorable in all environments. Yet it is often the case that certain environments are relatively favorable or unfavorable for all genotypes. And what that means to me is that, and Haldane also mentioned this in his paper, a sensible goal would be to identify and work to create those shared favorable environments and to prevent those environments that are unfavorable to all. I also want to mention to you another very exciting insight into the way genes and environments interact from recent work. And that is the surprising fact that environmental signals can be transmitted from one generation to the next in ways that produce specific effects on developing offspring. Now, I'm old enough to have been taught when I was in graduate school that this was impossible. This was exactly what could not happen. And yet it does happen, and in all kinds of animals and plants and microorganisms. So these effects are called transgenerational effects, and they can happen in 2 ways. First of all, in mammals, like ourselves, a mother's diet and other environmental experiences she has can directly influence her developing baby's environment as it grows in the uterus. Those are usually called maternal effects. But in addition to that, those epigenetic changes I mentioned to the DNA can be passed from parents to offspring in eggs or sperm, which means that the parental experience of fathers as well as mothers may be passed to the next generation. I'll explain this idea of transgenerational environmental effects with a classic example in this rather beautiful little crustacean. This is Daphnia, sometimes called the water flea, although it's not a flea, it's really more like a tiny little shrimp. These are very common in freshwater ponds. And Daphnia does something interesting. When mothers perceive that predators are present in their pond water, and they perceive that through a chemical cue, they produce young that develop differently. And their young develop with that really funky and remarkable tall helmet, which is a protective helmet because growing that helmet makes it very difficult for predators to get baby Daphnia into their mouth. So that is a very effective predator protection device. And what's interesting is that the baby Daphnia will grow this way. They'll grow the helmet even if they themselves develop in water without predators. And that's because this change, very remarkable change in development, is a transgenerational effect of their mother's experience, not their own direct environmental experience. I'll give you another very well-established and interesting example. Exposing stickleback fish to simulated predators in the laboratory causes changes to their gene expression in the brains, not only of the fish themselves, but also in the brains of their offspring that are associated with predator-avoiding behaviors. So those are effects that are carried over that show up in the behavior of the offspring, the next generation. Now, transgenerational effects on offspring brain and behavior are also being studied very actively in rodents, which, as you probably know, are much more similar biologically to us than either fish or crustaceans are. For instance, in male mice that experience traumatic stress early in their life, and in laboratories, traumatic stress is usually imposed by separating the infant mice from their mothers, either chronically or unpredictably. And both of those kinds of maternal separation create extreme trauma for the baby mice, and that trauma results in widespread epigenetic changes to the expression of the brain genes in these male mice that are accompanied by, those epigenetic changes are accompanied by depressive-like behaviors, and when those male mice become adults, in a reduced stress response. Beyond that, these epigenetic changes to traumatized male mice are transmitted in their sperm and have been found in their offspring and their grand offspring. And those babies and grandbabies show the same post-traumatic behaviors as the original traumatized male mice, even when the babies and grandbabies are raised normally without trauma. Now that's interesting, because mice are mammals. We have the same hormones. Okay, so these observations and many, many others have led to a new multi-generational perspective on the impact of the environment that I think may have really powerful implications for human health. We're just beginning to study these transgenerational effects in humans, but I can mention a couple of interesting findings. Diet, body mass index, exposure to environmental chemicals like BPAs, and smoking all cause epigenetic regulatory changes that increase the risk of obesity and diabetes in both children and grandchildren. And that's been found when those environmental stresses occur to mothers or to fathers. So a lot of very interesting studies of this when there's good enough medical records. Another interesting study showed that pregnant women who were exposed to lead had epigenetic shifts, multiple epigenetic shifts to gene expression, including in regions of their genome related to brain development. And those epigenetic changes showed up in their children's blood and in their daughters' fetal egg cells. And that means that those epigenetic changes would presumably be transmitted to the grandchildren as well of the women exposed to lead. Okay, enough data. I'll close and let our other distinguished panelists have a little time. But I hope I've convinced you that the bodies and behavior of individual organisms are not predetermined by their genes, but take shape in environmental context, and that this is equally true for us as human beings. We are enormously sensitive developmental and physiological systems, very finely tuned by our physical and our social environments. That insight opens up some exciting new possible approaches to treatment, I think, and to public health, because sometimes it's possible to change environments in ways that may have real benefits. But I also think that this heightened awareness of our sensitivity to environmental conditions is sobering, because that means environments really matter. They matter biologically. They matter to the way we develop and to the way we function, and maybe to future generations as well. So we need to change our thinking a little bit. The first challenge, I think, is just to recognize what aspects of the environment is what aspects of the environment are relevant, right? Those things can be surprisingly subtle. So for example, in plants, which is what I actually study in my laboratory, in plants, the important parts of the environment are not just things you would guess like light and nutrients and water, but touch and vibration. These things have developmental effects on plants. It's surprising. For animals, we've learned that socially as well as physically, experiencing environments will have biological impact, especially on the brain and behavior. So in human beings, along with things we might guess like diet or environmental contaminants, we need to consider social and emotional stresses as environmental factors that could matter potentially over generations. Taking the environment seriously in this way will mean we have to change how we work as scientists, and we have to change how we think, I think, more generally. But doing that is the first and, I believe, essential step toward creating the environments where all can thrive. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. As we just heard, creatures are malleable, plastic, shaped and responsive. Our genes do not determine us. Those facets of biology are wonderfully explored in Sonia Sultan's book, Organism and Environment, which was the standout scientific book for me in the year that I read it. And it provoked this evening's panel, and I am delighted to be here with Sonia and with two people so well placed to be able to explore the importance of the environments we experience, for instance, in housing or lack of it, for well-being and suffering, not least in terms of health. I am no more than a bridge between the first talk and their contributions. Sonia's book has convinced me of how important it is to get beyond talk of genetic determinism and to recognize that life is a dance between genes and environment, that creatures are open-ended things, that we're shaped by the cues we receive from the environments we experience. That includes this broad sense of environment, as we heard. That includes diet, opportunity for exercise, housing, emotional care and nurture. And as we heard, some of that affects human development not only for the creature that experiences it, but also for future generations. As the prophet Jeremiah put it, the parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. One reason for having this biology before us tonight is basically just to steel our arms, to stand by what we know as common sense. It matters, it really matters, that no one should grow up or live on the streets or in mouldy and damp housing, for instance. Of course, common sense can get lost surprisingly easily, and I think that's partly because of money. There's not a great deal of money to be made in encouraging people to eat more broccoli, for instance. And clever, new, expensive interventions, sometimes very well justified, make for good political press releases, but also important is providing playing fields and woodlands and forests for people to roam in. Less kind of flashy, but actually incredibly important. I hope that this evening's panel is going to shine light on a spotlight on the significance of environments in our health, not least when it comes to good housing. We all should, in whatever way we can, locally and nationally, whether we're involved in practical provision or just we want to inform policy, in whatever way we can, however locally, to really stress this message that environments matter. I want to end with the somewhat somber note of just remembering that we have lived through a long century of eugenic thinking, and I don't think its shadow has entirely departed from us. From the 19th century well into the 20th century, there was this idea that some people are just blessed genetically and others are cursed. Some communities, some races are genetically blessed and others are genetically cursed. And we should remember that adherents of the left and the right espoused these ideas across the 20th century, and if the churches in the long run became quite potent advocates against this sort of thinking, many a Christian embraced it in the 20th century. And of course, alongside eugenic thinking goes eugenic practice, the idea that we're doing the world a favor if we discourage people from having children or prevent them from having children, or horrifically even seek to eradicate those populations. I first read Professor Sultan's book at the same time, just as it happened, that someone on social media was pushing a eugenic line. And I thought, this really helps us to see that this, apart from being horrific morally, is also bad science. As we heard, it's far more true to say that there are environments in which all sorts of different genetic inheritances do badly or well, and that is to say there are some cursed genetic inheritances that do badly in all environments. Of course, outright eugenicist thinking is not voiced very often, but I do think it lingers in the idea that there are just inherently blighted, unhealthy populations. What a shame. But what can we do about it? Well, the biology that we've had before us this evening cautions us to look beyond stories of good genes and bad genes, and to see that what's going on here is that some people are experiencing good environments, food, housing, opportunities for exercise, support, that sort of thing, and others, sadly, in this very city, some extremely good environmental cues and some really tragic ones. It's cheap and easy to say that some people are just blessed or cursed by the genetics. It's harder, more expensive, difficult work to say that we should all embrace the hard work of providing and advocating for environments in which health and well-being flourish. In short, contexts really matter. And I thank Professor Sultan for her work both in the lab and in publishing, making such a cast iron case for that perspective, and also in anticipation, my colleagues here in housing and health who are already doing so much to provide for and argue for all that makes for human health and well-being. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah from the King's Fund, and I think the first thing to say is I could listen to Professor Sultan all evening. That was absolutely fantastic, thank you. And I'm going to give a perspective on health and housing and make just a few points by way of response. But for those of you that don't know the King's Fund or don't know us very well, we are a think tank. We try to provoke and publish research and incubate ideas to improve health and care across England. We also convene and train health and care workers. I mean, I was delighted to be invited this evening, and I'm so pleased that you're hosting this event, because quite often the King's Fund gets asked, and particularly at the moment, if you're familiar with the UK context, can you give us the latest commentary on A&E waiting times, or what's going wrong with elective waits? And we are very challenged as a health and care system at the moment in this country. But what often gets less discussion, less focus, less debate is the broader sense and conditions of what creates health, and the interactions between our environment and other things that lead to ill health. And it's something the King's Fund, through the work we've done over the past few years, has been trying to redress. I think also reflecting we have a model of healthcare that is a sickness service, and we often sort of treat people as such. And if we're to really grapple with some of the demographic challenges we face, some of the pressures on our health and care system, we have to create this shift to become more cognizant, more aware of what it means to create and keep good health. And our environment in the broadest sense is a part of that, and housing is a part of that. So I'm going to just make a few points by way of response. The first is, human flourishing, I think, is such a wonderful phrase to encapsulate what it means to have health and to keep health, and housing, as well as our broader environment, is part of that. I'm going to make a couple of observations on how housing and health interact across the life course, and how I've seen that in my work, not just at the King's Fund, but previously running the national respiratory charity, Asthma and Lung UK. I'm going to touch on implications for our health and care system, and just a word or so on the policy response. I do have a personal passion for this issue, and I'm going to narrow down a little to housing and health, because particularly in my last role, day in, day out, we were confronted at the respiratory charity with the consequences of children and adults exposed to cold, damp housing, and you saw that in the impact on their respiratory health, so increasing rates of asthma and other respiratory conditions, people calling our clinical helpline talking about their worries for their health because they were living in, damp, mouldy housing. And I'll always remember one of my most vivid memories of this, encapsulated by a severe asthma clinic I visited at Barts, major medical centre in London. On the one hand, the very best of the NHS, so a consultant trying to prescribe biologics, a new treatment class for severe asthma, and having, really detailed conversations about people's medical history and their asthma. But what came through the door was sort of human life, and so many of the conversations were people reflecting their living conditions. I'm worried that I'm living in substandard housing. Could you write me a letter, consultant, to my local authority so that I can raise concerns about the damp and the mould and the conditions I'm living in? So I think it just makes this point that we must consider the broader context. So housing and health is sort of intimately linked. We know that poor quality housing has an impact, a detrimental impact on health. And as I say, we see this through the life course. In some of my previous work, we really did have a focus on childhood, and we know the data is particularly stark. Children are particularly affected by living in poor quality housing. Unintentional injuries in the home are a leading cause of disability and death. And as well as a significant link to respiratory illness in childhood, cold, damp or overcrowded houses can affect basic childhood development. Another data point, we know UK children miss more school days due to disease burden from damp than in any other EU member state. So, and we are painted with a pretty sobering picture in terms of UK housing stock and quality of living conditions at the moment, exacerbated by a tough decade or so of austerity, increasing poverty. And we see this turn up at the front door of the NHS and at charities like the one I ran. We know for working age adults, poor quality housing and the stress associated with finding and financing adequate housing has a huge impact on quality of life and overall well-being. It impacts mental health, there's an interaction with poverty, there's an interaction with employment. And if I give you an example, I was visiting West London Mental Health Trust last Thursday and talking to them about the huge increase in demand they're seeing for their services. One of their reflections, both what they're seeing pitch up at the front door, but also as they're trying to discharge people, is that housing is a major component. Poor quality housing, insecure housing, worries about finding somewhere to live, driving, as part of a multitude of factors, of course, but driving mental health distress and mental health concerns. And then much of our NHS at the moment is pretty focused on discharge, getting people out of overcrowded hospitals back into the community. And poor quality housing is a blocker to some of that sort of flow that we need to have through our health and care system to meet the huge demand. So for working age adults, it's an issue. For our older population, we know the elderly are particularly vulnerable to the impact of cold or poor conditions in homes, including respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, dementia, and injuries from falls. And falls are the most common cause of deaths related to injury in people over the age of 75. So across the whole life course, environment matters, housing matters, and we have challenges. So what are the implications for our health and care system? I don't want to paint too gloomy a picture. There is a big opportunity, but we know that cold homes and fuel poverty contribute to excess winter deaths. We know that homes in poor condition increase the risk of falls and injuries, as I've said. We also know that from an NHS health and care system staffing perspective, there's an issue that sometimes staff struggle to find adequate housing, which impacts their ability to work. So how can the NHS play its part, and something the King's Fund is intimately interested in is, well, what's the policy response to this? And I think part of the policy response has to be to take this broader lens, to think about health in the broadest sense, and to join the dots and to knit the system together. And there have been various attempts at this. I don't want to use too much health jargon, but to give you one example, we have now across the country 42 integrated care systems, and they were set up to I suppose, on the premise that we need to take a broader approach to health. We need to recognise that population health matters hugely, and that different parts of the system for best outcomes need to work together. So in an English UK context, local authorities have a huge responsibility for housing. They need to work with our health and care system to make sure that we're considering the whole person rather than just a specific condition or need. And as I say, I think our healthcare system has been set up historically to focus on sickness and a condition rather than creating the conditions for good health. So I think by way of conclusion, I'm delighted that this event is happening, and I think the King's Fund would say we need more of this sort of conversation that really takes into account the breadth of environment and the impact that has on human health. We have an ageing population, we have a population in this country increasingly living with multiple long-term conditions. And running a charity, a health charity, spending a lot of time in health policy, people increasingly feel frustrated that they are treated as a series of conditions and have to navigate a system rather than being treated as a person living somewhere with a social context who happens to have some long-term conditions. So this big shift, the big opportunity is to shift left, to stop focusing so much purely on sickness, to embrace health in the broadest sense, and to devise policies and strategies and a policy response that really speaks to that. And if I just pick a final reflection from the past, when Nye Bevan did wonderful things to create our National Health Service, he was the Minister for Housing and Health, as opposed to just health. So I think a recognition that sometimes in our history we've grasped the links between environment and health, and the hope for now and for future is we can absolutely do that again and put it front and centre. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Mick Clark, and before we go any further, as the father of two teenagers, I've made a mental note to pinch your slide on vegetables. Firstly, it's a great honour to be part of this panel and discussion tonight, and my gratitude to Westminster Abbey and the Westminster Abbey Institute. Secondly, I'm not a scientist. I have the privilege of being the chief executive of The Passage, which is an organisation for many years that has worked to prevent and end homelessness. So at an operational level, we run a multitude of services, accommodation services, day services, employment services, and also a navigator scheme that links survivors of human trafficking who are also homeless back into safety and security. But also at a strategic level, working with other organisations, partners, NGOs and the government to try and shape policy. It's an honour to be sharing a platform with our panellists and Professor Sonia. And whilst I'm not a scientist, there are many threads of Sonia's work that resonate greatly with me from my experience in homelessness and the day job. Plasticity, the response of organisms to their environment, and the acknowledgement that organisms, including human ones, are a work in progress is a fact I see played out every single day at the Passage. Human beings, in many ways, are the greatest niche constructors. We strive to transform the environment that we find ourselves in, and perhaps no more than in our home, and placing a place that we can have the opportunities to flourish and to grow, a place that sometimes many of us may perhaps take for granted, a place to call home. And if you are homeless, of course, that opportunity is deeply restricted. We see it in our prevention work, where unless we intervene urgently, a situation can rapidly spiral. Indeed, there is evidence that much of street homelessness can be traced back to adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. In fact, in November 2021, The Lancet published a fascinating study of the first systemic review of ACEs and their association with health-related and functioning-related outcomes amongst adults in the homeless population. In our work at the Passage, we know that prevention is always better than cure, whether in our No Night Out scheme, so wonderfully supported by the Abbey, or in our patron, Prince William's recent Homewards initiative. However, we also see for those who are already homeless, in particular those in the acutest form, street homelessness, that the environment is crucial. We know organisms, including human ones, develop and function, as we have heard, in response to their environment. And housing and the environment that that creates is so, so vital. All of the Passage's accommodation projects are probably the most non-stereotypical accommodation you could imagine for so-called homeless people. But there's nothing special about that. It's simply the type of accommodation that you or I would want and expect if we were ever in that situation. Indeed, it's incumbent on all of us who are in the fortunate position to be able to do so, to create environments that best serve the developments of others. You know, homelessness is a societal issue that requires a societal solution. As Ridian Brooke beautifully once said, ultimately, what catches someone's fall from grace is someone else's grace. And I've seen the power of this approach played out so many times. If I share a story of someone I'll call Peter, if you met Peter when we first met Peter, after many years on the streets, you would probably be forgiven for thinking there was no hope. But giving Peter the opportunity to have decent housing, decent support structures around him, and then the opportunity through a wonderful scheme that ourselves and the Goring Hotel developed called Hotel School, where he was able to receive training to get into the hospitality industry, we fast forward and see Peter, who most people had written off, now in his 5th year of full-time employment, completely off benefits, and in his own flat, a place that he calls home. Environment is crucial. So, in my view, as the new government set out their agenda for change, there should be tangible recognition that the environment people find themselves in is critical to their development. We are all a work in progress in which the environment plays such a major factor. In my view, there needs to be a radical and long-term approach to housing and support. Sarah mentioned Nye Bevan. I'm struck by the need for another Beveridge report type moment, both in social housing in this country and also in the rollout of adequate youth provision for young people to give them the support that they need and they deserve to develop, so that we can finally reframe homelessness away from something that we simply manage to something that it is possible to prevent. So in conclusion, in my view, we need a vision of change and a message of hope from our new government. Creating environments that individuals can develop to their full potential needs to be critical to such a strategy. I'm a big believer that I am my brother's keeper. Homelessness is indeed a societal issue that needs a societal solution. But creating positive environments in which individuals can develop and flourish is not just good for that individual, it's good for all of society. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Well, we're delighted, we're grateful that so many of you have come this evening, and we want to leave plenty of time to take some questions from you. But this is a moment for a pause to see if anyone on the panel would like to respond to anything else that has been said. I think the talks actually fitted together really nicely. There's probably not that much needed by way of additional comments. But Professor Sultan, I particularly want to turn to you, not to put you entirely on the spot,
okay.
but to see if there's anything in what has been said in response to the sort of biology that you have devoted yourself to that you want to pick up on.
Well, if it's okay, I'll say two things. First, I wanted to pick up on a few things that you said, Andrew, because what motivated me to study what I study and to become a scientist is the history of, well, let's say the legacy of eugenics that you mentioned, because it's very much present, it seems to me, that the way we look at each other is, in many cases, is colored by this idea that people have better genes and worse genes. I think James Watson has said quite a bit about this. If people are fated by their genes to not be as able or as intelligent or whatever it may be, all completely bogus scientifically, I assure you. But if that's the attitude, of course, there's no point in trying to educate them better or improve their circumstances or give them access to different opportunities. There's no point because that is their destiny. Well, that way of thinking, I don't know much about the UK. Certainly it's alive and well in the US because it allows us to turn away from each other. And that's why, to me, it's important to be able to work from the inside, as a scientist, to be able to make that point. That's just not good science. That's just not how it is. So that way of thinking, people say, well, it's a kind of an inconvenient truth, right? It's unfortunate, but this is the reality. That's not correct. So, my goal is to be able to empower anyone who's interested to know that is not right from a scientific perspective. But I appreciate you bringing that up. And the other thing I wanted to mention, really following up on both Sarah's and Mick's comments, was the following really remarkable anecdote about our sensitivity to our housing and our environments. I just read this the other day. This is a study that was done in the 1980s, very interesting study, looking at a number of people in one hospital in the US who were all in the hospital to have the same kind of surgery, exactly the same surgery, gallbladder removal, a very straightforward surgery. And these people had a really unusual idea, which was to create a very careful sample by taking out the people who were terribly ill or had other complications, and just looking at all the people who were having this surgery, who were basically healthy people, and comparing people who were housed during their stay in the hospital in a room overlooking a green space with trees, or in a room whose window looked out on a brick wall. Just happened to be a hospital, and those were the two kinds of rooms people had. And these doctors compared the outcomes of the surgery in these two different groups of people, either looking out on green for a few days or looking out on a brick wall. And what they found is that the people who looked out on the brick wall took longer to heal and required more narcotic painkillers during their recovery in hospital than those who looked out on a green space. So when I say we are remarkably sensitive, that seems to me to illustrate that sensitivity in a way that, we have to really think about. If we are that physically affected by a sense of well-being and calm, what does it mean for people who were denied that in their experience all the time? So I just wanted to bring that story to your attention, because moved me a lot.
There have been so many wonderful anecdotes that have struck me this evening. And of course, I think we're probably all convinced that things can be done. And it's not the job of the panel to be able to answer my question, but I'm left asking myself, what can I do? You know, I can't influence hospital architectural and botanical policy, but I think we need to go out from here all looking for the opportunities, however local, you know, even if it's just what food we cook at home and the influence that we have in our really small neighbourhood. These are all important things. Do either of the other panelists have anything that you want to say in response to what's been said? I'll give you a moment.
Well, there's a very brief point that builds on, it's actually something you said as well, but builds on what Sonia was just saying, which is, I mean, you've given a brilliant scientific overview, but some of this, you know, the kind of common sense element, which is environment matters, and yet it often isn't mainstreamed. And my example that was brought to mind when you talked about common sense is Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, talking about treatment for COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, respiratory illness. Now, physical exercise, breathing exercises, activity is wonderful. It can do wonders. And his reflection in conversation was, if physical activity was a drug, it would be a blockbuster, and it would be seen as such in the system and talked about as this wonderful innovation that we must spend huge amounts of money on and get into, you know, our system at every level. But of course it's exercise, and so, you know, no one's going to pay lots of money to advertise it, or so there's something about how we mainstream kind of common sense and stuff that we know is good for us, or where there's incredibly strong evidence that it is good for us, our wider environment, but somehow it's not new, it's not seen as innovative, and the incentives in the system don't support us promoting it in a certain way.
Same goes for broccoli.
Exactly.
The broccoli farmers had a real lobby to promote broccoli as a health solution. That would make sense.
Yeah.
Mick?
I just struck, again, in terms of the phrase you used there, mainstreaming common sense. And I remember when some of the projects that we run, we work with some very challenging, you know, people, particularly if they're coming straight off the street. And we did a huge refurbishment project where we completely, you know, transformed the building, lovely ensuite, you know, rooms, etc. The most common sense when you look at it in hindsight, but incidents, if you were to compare incidents of people kicking off, etc., getting annoyed, pre-refurbishment and post, they plummeted, absolutely plummeted. And it's the same in terms of the hospital story, in terms of, you know, we changed it from people looking at brick walls, if you like, to actually looking at greenery. And sometimes it is the most sensible thing. Well, of course people are going to react better to a nicer environment than one that doesn't look that particularly good. But it's how you mainstream what is common sense.
I think where my grandparents' common sense is now exceeded is the sense that we have that this reaches as deeply into us as what we attribute to our genes. So I read a story about some fish in is it Lake Tanganyika, I think, where it was thought there were two completely different species of fish. Those that live on the top and those that live on the bottom. They look completely different. It turns out they're genetically completely the same species of fish, but if they grow up the bottom, they have these huge jaws for crunching shellfish. If they grow up at the top, they have very sleek mouths because they're taking in algae, same species. So that's the danger is that we don't go beyond what my grandparents would have recognised, which is, you know, it's good to have exercise and eat broccoli, as if we were just these immutable things that are slightly affected by our environment, but actually the whole of what we are is open-ended, and our genes are just a basis that affords the opportunity to be like this or like that, and we respond like all the way in to the, right into the nucleus of each of our cells. This is a pretty revolutionary and important point. And that's been the springboard for this evening's talk, and I think we can turn it over to audience questions.
Wonderful. So friends, we have a bit of time for questions, conversation, at least 20 minutes. So in this session, please feel free to respond to anything you've heard from the panel, or indeed to introduce a topic which you consider to be related. So who would like to kick us off? Yes, just over here.
Thank you. My name's Emily and I work in global health. So I have a question that, Sarah, you kind of alluded to the disconnect between local authorities and central government, where local authorities kind of have the levers for social housing and a lot of things that would improve social determinants of health, but they're not necessarily empowered or incentivized to do so because all the funding is concentrated within like the public services group in the Treasury in central government. So my question, and you kind of alluded to exercise, right? Parkrun is a great example where local authorities tend not to do it because it costs them a lot, even though the overall social impact is massive. So really it's tragedy of the commons. So my question is, how do we incentivize or empower local authorities to take those decisions that are going to improve human flourishing when they don't necessarily have the power or incentive to do so? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. I've only been at the King's Fund for about 8 months, and I've been trying to get out and meet lots of different people and parts of the health and care system. So I've been and sat in 2 local authorities and talked to them about this very issue. I think I'll keep it brief, and I'd say a couple of things. I'd say there's huge enthusiasm within local authorities because they naturally kind of get this. You know, they see it day in, day out, the consequences of poor quality housing, the lack of green space impacting people's ability to exercise and so on and so forth. I mean, we have a huge funding issue in local authorities. You know, we often talk, I spend my life at the moment talking about the difficult financial challenge for the NHS, you know, sort of times 10 for local authorities. So, I think one answer is, I sat with a brilliant local authority in and around Sheffield. We had a deep dive into poverty for a whole morning, and they were imaginative, they were creative, they were talking about what really matters is that we have a single welcoming front door so that people just find us. It doesn't matter how they find us, and then we do our best to respond to them however we can. It's our job to patch together the services that we can offer, however restrictive they are at the moment. So there's no lack of, I think, desire and leadership potential. There is a severe lack of cash. Of course, it's not all money, but I think we've got to be honest about the financial challenge in local authority land because it's pretty stark. And with a growing population, an ageing population, the social care need and demand is squeezing out almost everything else because of the responsibility to provide social care. Just the one other point I'd make, which is the more positive point, is at least there has been recognition of this issue. So the idea, I didn't talk much, but I referenced integrated care systems. It really is exactly to this point, is you can't improve health unless you pull on all the levers that improve, that have the ability to improve health. And that means housing, it means public health, tobacco control and physical activity and the ability to stop 5 kebab shops opening next door to one another, which will impact how we eat. Final point, we've got this great slide that we roll out at the King's Fund of an ICS chief executive who said, well, the interview was fantastic coming for this role. They asked me loads of questions about improving population health. I felt really excited that I could do this job. But since I've started the job, all anyone asks me about is NHS performance targets and waiting lists, and which speaks to the challenge we have. There is hope, there is recognition. The challenge for this government is making this shift happen in an environment that will stay reasonably cash constrained.
Thank you. Bishop Peter, and then the gentleman behind.
My name is Peter Selby. I've a long list of things I used to do and not a very long list of things I do. I want to stay with money. And I want to ask whether Sonia thinks that money is now built into our genetic inheritance as an obsession. Because if we're going to talk about housing, there is no market more distorted by money than housing. It's not just that there isn't funding for certain things. There's a huge building programme going on all over London, and it's not actually dealing with the problem that has to be dealt with. So what I want to ask is, do we not have to address that which causes a child to grow up and quite quickly learn that the house that they live in, if they have one, is not just a home, but a source of financial security and a kind of a pension component of major sorts. And don't we have to tackle that distortion at a very fundamental level? The church I belong to had a doctrine commission once which worked out, which had published a report on what it was to be human, and the subtitles were power, money, sex, and time. And money was the one that surprised everybody by being there. But it seems to me to be at the heart of our intergenerational inheritance, that we worry about it, want it, can't manage without it, and let it run so much.
So Sonia first, I think, and then I think possibly each of our other three panelists might have something to say.
Well, one of the interesting changes that is happening now to thinking for a number of biologists is the recognition that in addition to an internal inheritance, there's an ecological inheritance. So for instance, baby birds are born into a nest that they can then use very often as adults when their own parents are gone. Baby beavers are born with a lodge that they get to live in, and baby humans are born with or without a silver spoon in their mouths, right? And that recognition for us is, I think, all about money. And it is no secret that it changes everything if you are born with the spoon. And yet part of the sort of pretense about genetic determination is that that's not what's important. What's important is the internal qualities that people have. And of course, that's a lie. Particularly in this respect, I would say.
I think that's a beautiful response, and another great example of where the science can steal our arm. It's not that we want to learn our morals or our philosophy or religious philosophy from science, but if we're interested in reality, then, that's why I was in the business of being in science and religion, because I think, well, if I'm going to understand the world in respect to God, I may as well understand the world that I'm trying to understand theologically as accurately as possible. So I just think it's beautiful when we can get scientific ballast because we're interested in reality. Bishop Peter, almost no bishop has done more than you have to draw this subject to our attention over your ministry. So what can I say in response, except very practically that when I hear these stories of a gap between what needs to be done and there being funding for it, then I'm challenged, and I hope all of us here who have frankly more money than we need are challenged to think, well, we certainly want the government to step up, but also what can we do to support, for instance, charities like yours? What better use of our money could we think of than that? Sarah.
Well, briefly, we often talk about it in terms of the deficit, so the impact of poverty on health. You have poorer health outcomes if you are living in deprivation, and there's a whole load of complexity and nuance to that. So we've published quite a bit on poverty and health, and you find it much harder to access healthcare. If you are in employment, it's likely to be harder to take time off. If you are so worried about money that the order of priority that takes in the sort of hierarchy of things that you got to think about and that are occupying your mind, the space for thinking about your well-being and your health and turning up for your breast screening appointment shrinks. So I think the relationship between deficit and poverty and health is very strong. And I think the other point is, which it doesn't feel, I mean, not in this room perhaps, but in the national conversation, we have seen this very big spike in poverty. Is it being talked about enough? We've seen a spike in destitution. And then there is this issue about dignity. The King's Fund works with lots of charities like Mick's brilliant charity. And we were hearing about an organisation that provides beds. So, you know, forget whole houses. This is for families and children that don't have beds. And this speaks to, I think, the kind of human dignity around the deficit as well. So, yes, it will impact your health poorly. It's also just incredibly tough and miserable. Mick?
I think a few things. Firstly, there's different cultures, isn't there? And so the house owning culture here is perhaps different to say, even other European countries. But I do know there's a sizable chunk of people who would give their right arm to ever dream of having something as luxurious as a council house. And I do wonder, in terms of, there's talk of, is it GB energy that it's talked about? I kind of think there needs to be GB housing. You know, and just to emphasise here, the passage is completely apolitical, but state-owned housing that isn't going to be flogged on years down the line. There's plenty of other models, I think, 2 European countries that allow people to pass it on through to the next generation, but they can't sell it on. So having decent housing, I know economists, but the more kind of infrastructure projects you do, I think is good for the economy. Not just, no offence to property developers, they've supported us a lot, but actually having it state-owned, I think would be very good. And going back to the previous question, there's a similarity here when Sarah was talking around leadership and desire. If you look at, say, street homelessness in London, no one's in charge. No one body is in overall charge. There's about 30, if you include central government, there's about 36 separate bodies. You know, you need someone, a body who is in charge, who is leading it, who is taking the strategy forward. What's encouraging is hearing a more of a cross-departmental approach, because as we've heard tonight, housing and homelessness isn't just about housing, it's about health. It's all interwoven. So a more of a cross-departmental structure would be very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. Gentleman over here.
Thanks. I'm James Kidner, formerly of the Foreign Office and now in the much more foreign world of technology. It's been a riveting conversation, and I think we all wish you, everyone on the panel, the best in your endeavours. But I just want to bring up a sort of issue about be careful what you wish for. And for those of us who don't like broccoli, that's a sort of early, dare I say it, win-win. But I was struck by a bit of research that came out of Finland, I think, about a year ago. And there is no country in the world that is more civilized and organized and, dare I say it, better providing for its people than the Finns, if occasionally a little bit gloomy. This research looked at two genetically identical populations, one who lived in Finland and the other who lived over the border in Russia, who 80 years ago had been turned into Russians by the Winter War of 1939. And the Finnish government were looking at a particular problem they had, which was with allergies and asthma in army recruits, which were approaching 50% of those who were coming in for assessment. There was no such problem in the Russian population. In other words, something about the way in which, over 2 generations, people had been brought up and accustomed to living in first-rate housing had done a disservice to them. And we focus very much in the discussion, rightly, on the problems of poverty and squalor and slums and homelessness. But prosperity also brings its problems, and it comes into Peter's issue, that the Finns house their population very well, but the consequence is not always entirely benign. I guess it's a question for Sonia, really, but for all of us, there is this challenge that we need to know what good looks like before we can really aim towards what is really good?
Well, if that's for me, that's interesting, and I think you're exactly right. We do need to know what good looks like, and sometimes the transgenerational effects are surprising ones. And that's been found true for other things, for example, nutritional environment, that sometimes the more well-nourished grandparents have grandsons who have less good health as adults than the less well-nourished grandparents. Now, one complication for understanding those patterns is that we don't always know who were the individuals we lost in the intervening generation. In the case you mentioned, I would particularly have that question, whether there were individuals in Russia who did not survive. Whether the population started out from the same pool doesn't really answer the question how many people didn't, how the population may have changed in that intervening generation, either genetically or epigenetically. So for me, scientifically, that's an incomplete, suggestive, but an incomplete result, right? But that is an important point. I agree with you very strongly that we don't really know what good is from a transgenerational perspective. Interestingly, and Sarah will know a great deal more than I do about this, but for many of the most common public health issues, I mentioned, I guess, obesity, but also for asthma, for Alzheimer's, there are new approaches to look at things that we have neglected in the past. And I think for asthma, one that's turned out to be very important is the microbiome, because the microbiome, the bacteria that live inside us, we have a lung microbiome as well as a gut microbiome. And the lung microbiome is very strongly, has a great impact on our immune system function. And of course, that's what asthma is all about. So we really don't know enough biology yet to know how to identify good environments. That's why, to me, that's kind of the first step. And it's a big step because it's not always the obvious factors.
Yep, if I could make a brief point, to build on that, I think it's an excellent question and it's a very important point. And it reminds me, I spent many years before the respiratory charity working at Cancer Research UK. And so we grappled with some of these issues that, prosperity does wonderful things in many ways. If you just take a sort of Western prosperous diet, not always. And so you see increase in some cancer types linked to environment, and you see differences comparatively. So I think that's an important point to note. It isn't linear. But there is another point that we really grappled with, and that's how it makes people feel and the blame. So as we increasingly understand more, it's not just our genes, our lifestyle in the case of cancer risk plays a really important part. What we grappled with is trying to guard against that, I've got cancer because I didn't eat enough broccoli sort of conversation, which people can feel very deeply. And as we know, there's a complexity there. So, I think on the one hand, and this is a very sort of medical research charity answer, more science will help us understand better. But I think how we communicate this sensitively and how we communicate the complexity is really important.
Thank you very much indeed. Friends, I'm very sorry because I know there are other questions, but I'm going to keep us to time, partially because I know at least 3 of our panel have got journeys home this evening, and so we're on a bit of a tight squeeze. But to conclude, I just want to say 2 things. Firstly, on behalf of the Dean and Chapter and the Institute and of our audience tonight, an immense thank you to Sonia, Andrew, Sarah, and Mick for a lively and wide-ranging conversation. To Sonia, if I may especially, for being the person whose intellect, whose research interest has really sparked so much of this evening's conversation. We're hugely in your debt. And to my dear friend Andrew, who is so good at stitching together interesting ideas and interesting possibilities into themes. So a huge thank you to all our panelists for this evening. That's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, isn't it exciting at the moment when there is a new government to be able to be part of a series of conversations where there is no conclusion, there's no full stop to this evening. So I would want for myself and for one another to pick up the challenge that has been laid before us by each of our panelists in different ways, not only for our own lives, but also as advocates in our own spaces. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to you for the richness of your questions and attentions. Fill in your feedback form, and then you'll get a glass of wine. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists.